Okay, today I'm interviewing Sandra King, Executive Director of Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles. Sandy, I know you began your professional career as a school teacher. How did you get from being a school teacher, and how did you enter into the fields of social work?
Well, actually, I spent a number of years teaching school right out of college and just after I was married. And then when I began having children, I stayed home. So I was home for a number of years. And when I was prepared to go back into something professionally, having had children of my own, I wasn't prepared to go back to facing a classroom where I knew that every child was filled with so many needs and all, and I felt like I'd rather work with people one-on-one, which was my idea those days. And so I was very interested in a volunteer job, which came up a volunteer, opportunity, which came up because I heard Barbara Kaplan speak about this little storefront she had just started for Jewish Family Service. I thought of it as possibly a way of entering back into the workforce, but I really didn't know anything about social work. Somehow I grew up, when I was in Berkeley, it was an ivory tower, and I didn't know anything about anything except my major was English, and I was going to write the great American novel, and I went into teaching because I got married. My husband was still in law school, and I had to work. So it was all very far away from anything related to social work. And I took the volunteer opportunity more because I was prepared to do something but not quite ready to go back to work. And then I sort of learned what social work was from that experience with Barbara Kaplan and the Freda Mohr Center, which was this little walk-in counseling center for older people that she had just kind of conceived of, convinced JFS to start, and had begun using volunteers very extensively. So I had this volunteer experience as a case aide at Freda Mohr, and learned about social work, was really taken with the idea of, at that time I saw myself as working as a counselor and working one-to-one with people, which was kind of, or in small groups, which is kind of my idea leaving teaching. And it's funny because I never quite felt comfortable. During the years my kids were growing up, I worked as a substitute teacher 1 or 2 days a week just to kind of keep in touch with the world. And I never wanted to give up that credential, so I kind of kept it alive, paying $25 every few years or something, just because I thought, well, I like this idea of social work. But I volunteered for a couple of years, just loved it, and then went back and decided to go back and get my MSW. Went back to UCLA, and I just really felt very, very drawn to it from the very beginning.
As a volunteer, what kind of training, because you were in a different profession, what kind of training did you have? Now it was a senior center. What kind of training did Jewish Family Service provide?
Well, that was really the beauty of it, and that's what attracted me, and I think to this day still attracts many of the volunteers that we have. The training was basically provided by Barbara Kaplan, who was the everything at the center. She designed the idea, and she also ran the center, worked with clients, but supervised volunteers. The training consisted basically of things like listening skills, lots of information on aging, working with people in groups and individually. The whole idea, the concept of the sort of the therapeutic relationship, the idea of what your role is as an active listener, as a person offering what we used to call, it wasn't counseling, it was sort of I can't remember, maintenance or something. I mean, we didn't, but in any case, it was working with people who brought in their problems, and we listened to them. And so the training at that time, they had a beginning 6-day course that was run centrally through the agency that actually Ethel Taft taught, and she was a volunteer coordinator. And then we came back to the storefront, and we would sit in with an experienced case aide. It was Ruth Haber, who's still a case aide at Freda Mohr Center, and I think Bernice, no, not Bernice, but Ruth, and there were a few other people who are still around. But so we sat in on interviews with experienced case aides and worked with Barbara. Then we began seeing people, and somebody would sit in with us just to kind of provide the support. The very important part, I think, of the training is that we were given the feeling it was perfectly acceptable, in fact, desirable to say to someone, you know, I'd really like to get someone else's ideas on this because we want to be sure that we're offering you the right information. So would you mind if and at that very moment we could go up and talk to Barbara, or we could ask Barbara to sit in on an interview, so that people felt, or even after the fact in reading the write-ups we did every day, if there was a question, we were encouraged to call and say, you know, we've been thinking about this, and we want. So there was always this feeling of being open to amend or change. There was always a sense of you having the ability to kind of be as good as you could be on something, to try it out if it didn't work, you know.
And now describe a little bit about the population, because it was kind of a unique population.
It was a population that was, they were old. They weren't what we would consider very old now. They tended to be in their, I would say, 70s. Some in their 80s, some in their 60s. Pretty much an immigrant population, lots of them unassimilated. In other words, even though they had been here for many, many years, many of them had Yiddish as their primary language, some Hebrew, Russian, but a lot of them spoke English, but it was still a very much sort of ethnically focused population where they felt comfortable with a certain kind of setting, and that's what the center was designed to provide. They were literally all foreign-born. They didn't know from, quote, counseling. And I think, that's what we called it, supportive maintenance. So we tried to design it as, I remember Barbara used to talk about it as wanting to create a setting where the problems of aging were treated as kind of the normal and natural stages of the human condition, and not something that you have to be ashamed of or want to hide. So that by design it was an open setting, and there wasn't the feeling you had to go into a room and whisper about something because you were having a problem that was related to getting old. And that was very comfortable for people. And in fact, Barbara designed the whole thing because people weren't coming to the traditional office setting on Vermont at that time. This population wasn't.
Now, when you started, you were a volunteer. You went back to school and you got your MSW. You came back, and at what point did you become director of Jewish Families?
It took a little while. Well, what happened was I went back to school, so I was gone for 2 years, although I think I volunteered in the summer too, but just about the time I was ready to graduate to get my MSW, Barbara was going back. I believe she was something like 60 then, but she was going back to get her PhD at USC. And so, maybe she's 55. But anyway,
let's not put that in.
Oh, no, we won't put that in. Okay, but she was, because she had started late in life, too. I think she came as an MSW when she was about 50. Really? So it was really her accomplishments were really incredible. And by the way, I came because I learned about all this because I heard her speak at a UCLA extension program for people kind of finding themselves going back into volunteering or workforce or school. And I was so impressed with her, that's what started. But anyway, she was going on for a PhD, and so there was a vacancy. In those days, I think it was called coordinator of Freda Mohr Center. There were only 2 staff. Well, there were 2 professional staff and 1 secretary. And so because there was that vacancy, I actually applied for, I had learned about something else first before I learned of this, and I applied for another job at UCLA that would have dealt with child abuse. It was a totally new field at that time, very exciting, and I had a case in my internship with it, but then the grant didn't come through or something, and so when I looked, this was by far the most appealing and it was kind of coming home. And so I was coordinator of the Freda Mohr Center at that time, and there was one other social worker and a receptionist, and we had about maybe 10 volunteers, no, maybe 20 volunteers.
The other social worker was Stella Kleinrock?
No. She was Norma.
Oh, Cooper,
right. And Norma was not an MSW. She was an experienced BA level social worker. Done a lot of work sort of over the years in different arenas. Had worked with Barbara Kaplan.
Okay, now I know that the Freda Mohr Center started as a little storefront.
Tiny little.
Very little. And where everyone was free to come in and even feed their dog water or cookies or whatever. How do you see, I mean, what is the growth development that you have seen? Let's do it kind of in increments, because there has been a huge growth development. So let's start with the Freda Mohr Center and when it became a multi-service center.
Okay. What happened was that I was very fortunate in starting to work at Freda Mohr at a time when it's like the world was discovering that people were living longer, and all of a sudden there was a recognition that older people did better if they got specialized services, that they were getting lost if there were services for every age and they just had to take their share. So a few things were happening, and one of the things that was happening was that there was some federal legislation, the Older Americans Act, which was passed in 1965, I believe, and the Administration on Aging was created. And it took a while, but what happened was the allocations were made out of that money first for meals, and there was a meals program. I had nothing to do with it, but it was small, and it had just gotten started when I came to the agency. But there was also an allocation that came to the agency for a multi-service center. The city was creating, with this Older Americans Act money it had just gotten, was creating a service center in every one of the 15 councilmanic districts. And the councilman in our area approached us to see if we were interested in feeling that apparently they had approached Federation or something. There was some question the first year, and so United Way ran it, and there was a feeling that it needed to be in the area where all the older people lived, and that it was appropriate for JFS to be the sponsor. And so we took over the sponsorship of the multi-service center, which connected us with the city AAA and the funding as one of the 15, now they're called focal points, but multi-service center kind of networks in the city. So there was an existing building that apparently United Way in the first year had rented, which was down across the street from the farmers market, which you remember well. And so we started out with those two centers, trying to use one for the services mandated by the AAA, and the other maintaining the model of walk-in counseling that Barbara had created. Then it got complicated because there was a third center which the Federation had run and had opened a number of years ago as a information and referral volunteer-run center, which happened to be 2 doors down from the one across from Farmers Market. So I started in 1975. For 2 years, it was all calm and quiet, and we had this tiny little store next to the fish market. And then we acquired, in the same year, in 1977, these 2 other centers. So there were some very hectic years where we actually, in fact, I do believe, Denise, who was my supervisor at that time, suggested I buy a skateboard because I was running up and down. We had 3 we had lots of storefronts, very little staff, as you well remember, and we kind of, I'm reminding you because you were a very valuable employee at that time.
Well, what I remember also is that you needed, for requirements for a multi-service center, an activity director, and you needed activities. So instead of just a counseling center, it became an information and referral and an activity center.
Right, and information referral we had always done before, but we had never done activities. Mm-hmm. And we'd never kept records. Remember this was a long way from an MIS system, but I remember we tried different colors. If they came in for this, they got a brown file. If they came in for this, they got a red file. Remember that?
It was very informal.
Very informal, but very practical. It worked. I mean, we did it. Mm-hmm. And also we learned a tremendous amount from that because it was basically our first grant, other than, as I said, the meals, which were handled. The meals grant was handled in a strange way in those days because it was actually managed by an accountant who somebody had. The agency felt like it couldn't run it, apparently. I mean, I didn't know anything about it, and there was a person running the actual meal, the delivery of the meals and all, and she contracted with a caterer, but all of the grants management was done by some accountant, and it was... So it wasn't anything we had any experience with. So this was the first grant that we wrote and managed and, renewed and really worked on. And so it was a very, very distinct learning experience.
And from that building that was temporary across from the farmer's market, a new building was built.
Right. We could see that the 3 buildings didn't work, and the 3 staffs, and the 3 secretaries, and the 3 budget. I mean, it was, no. So in 1977, I think, at the end of 77, we found a building and got a grant to remodel an old bank that was sort of not exactly midway between, but it was closer to Fairfax and across the street, right? Really sort of across the street from where we are now. And we put all 3 centers together. And that was a feat, as I recall. The most difficult part of that whole thing was making sure that all 3 secretaries were happy because there was a person who was basically kind of a secretary but felt they really ran each one of the 3, right? And so we have to find roles for each one of the 3.
Oh, I remember that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
We did.
Outside of the secretarial obstacle, what other obstacles did you encounter?
Well, one of the ones that began just about that time, we were now 2 years into it, was that it was difficult to kind of know how to deal with the fact that there was so much growth possibility in an agency that was in all other arenas remaining fairly much the same, stable, a small amount of growth, but not a great deal. Mm-hmm. And so here's an agency which for 100 and in those days 30-something years, now it's 140, 145 years, so it was 120 years or something, 130 years, had been basically a counseling agency providing counseling and concrete services out of, in those days, I guess 3 regional offices, maybe 4, and also done resettlement, where suddenly aging was kind of becoming so visible and had the potential of becoming so large. So it was a very heady time. I mean, we were very excited, and you remember that, I'm sure. It was a very exciting time. We thought we could do anything. Mm-hmm. And all we had to do was do it well and know what we were doing, or sometimes know what we were doing, and work very hard. And it was very exciting. There were wonderful people that were invested in it. And so we had this sense of excitement, and the world was open to us.
But you were very good, I remember, and kind of on the cutting edge of the grants. I remember that it was, I mean, outside of the grant for the multi-service center, it seems to me that you were talking grants all the time.
Yeah, because what happened was the multi-service center grant sort of put us in touch with the world of grants. And once we got into that, we learned about, like, at the same time, no, not right then, but soon after that we became aware of the home secure, the grant for home secure through that. It's sort of like, until then, I don't think anybody had ever figured that there was any avenue for money except United Way and United Jewish Fund and donations. And when we started realizing grants were a possibility, once we got over the hurdle of the board and other leadership and staff of the agency and other directions being comfortable with this, which was a very long and difficult process. But the possibilities, once we got into that arena, were just endless. And a big next step after this one came when I think it was in the beginning of 79, early, maybe winter, sort of January, February of 79, there was a RFP that came out. Actually, it was like a letter that announced the idea that the state had to start the MSSP, Multi-Purpose Senior Services Project. That came out of what was happening in the 70s and 80s when the federal government sort of suddenly realized that if people were living longer, which they sort of realized in the 70s, and they continued to use nursing homes at the rate that they were using them, which at that time, excuse me, was very, the numbers aren't anything what they are now, but the sense of going into a nursing home was something that was, considered very frequently because there were no alternatives. So a nursing home seemed to be a natural step for a lot of people, and yet what was happening was that only a few weeks after people went into nursing homes, they normally, even if they had gone in as private pay, they ended up on Medicaid, what we call Medicaid nationally. So the government was beginning to realize this big chunk of money that was going to be spent on Medi-Cal for nursing homes. And so they began to look for alternatives. And the alternatives to institutionalization became a kind of catchword. One of the alternatives that was offered was taking a small portion of the money that was scheduled for nursing home beds, leaving those beds vacant, and spending it instead on community-based care. And there was a special waiver, 2176 waiver, which states could apply for to start up that kind of program. It was called a home and community-based waiver. And they conceived of MSSP and decided, the California Department of Aging decided it would go for it. So in those days, I don't know how many states went for it. Now almost every state has that waiver, but and MSSP to this day continues to be, in my mind, one of the most successful programs that really does what it intends to do. But what happened is they sent out a letter of interest and said they were going to have this RFP coming out. Someone from Federation got the letter and sent it out to Cedars, to us, to a number of other agencies, and said, is anybody interested? And they called a meeting. And I remember Roz Benitez was out of town, and so I went for the agency, and nobody was very interested. Cedars was afraid of this, and Federation said it didn't provide service. Nobody was really ready to pick up on it, and I figured, why not? It was just a letter. Okay, so you could send a letter of intent saying you were interested. So we did, and then we really got, very interested. And that was the kind of transforming grant, because it really, number one, we were an agency at that time of, I don't think our budget was, the whole agency, I don't think had a budget of more than maybe $5 million or maybe $6 million. And this was I don't even think that much, and this was a $2 million grant. We called it a $1 million grant because we didn't even know. But from the first day, it was a $2 million a year grant. So it had a huge impact on the agency, and it also made us both a recipient of grant money, but also a provider of, a contractor to providers, because we could purchase services for other, for our clients.
The MSSP stands for
Multi-Purpose Senior Services Project.
Okay, and I just want to go back a tiny bit when you said that the board was skeptical about grants and whatever. How did they accept such a big grant? I mean, was that an obstacle?
There were a few sort of visionary people who could see the value of it and who could recognize that this would be a huge aid to people in this in our community. So I think the areas of concern were around the fact of, would we lose our autonomy, and would we have to begin doing things that are, we've been our board is very hands-on, very concerned about operations. Would we become sort of indebted to the state? Right. That was number one. Number two, were we getting into uncharted waters that we didn't know what we were getting into for, which was true. Number three, a big concern was, would we create expectations? This was a 3-year demonstration. Would we create expectations, and then the grant is over, and then the Jewish community will have to support it? In some ways, the fact that it was so large, the grant was so large, helped, because as I explained to I don't know how many people, and to this day I keep making the same explanation because there are still people who think that could happen, that our entire allocation from Federation isn't as large as this one grant. So there's no question in the world that if this grant ended, no one would turn to Federation to expect it to support it, because we don't get that money for all of what we do in the community. We don't get that much. So, and I think people have gotten more comfortable with it. But there were a few leaders on the board who were very excited, as I was, and I sort of used them to be the spokespeople. There was a lot of difficulty that other staff had because they saw aging growing. And I remember right after we'd gotten MSSP and Home Secure and the AAA grant, there was someone made the statement that we shouldn't, I can't remember, in some way not acknowledge it, or we would be seen as an aging agency. And I remember saying to Arnold that this is a funny time to talk about that. We just took on an obligation of I don't know how many millions of dollars worth of government money to provide aging services to aging. We can't pretend we're not, But it did go on for a long way. And then the answer always was, well, it's a demonstration. It's not permanent. It took a long time until there was kind of an acceptance of it. The staff always felt sort of like they were seen as very temporary. The whole idea, I mean, even starting, I remember from my very first day on the job, when I came to my first staff meeting, and in those days the professional staff were about, I don't think there were 50 people, maybe 30. I mean, it was in a small room at 590. And one of the professionals came over to me and, congratulated me for being hired. And then she said, are you, something like, when are you going to go for a real job? Because working with aging was not seen as a real social work sort of gem. I mean, it was kind of what you took because there was nothing else. And she said, are you going to sort of look around and, till something else comes up? I said, no, I'm interested in this. But, so I think it was true agency-wide for a long time. We talked about case management, and there was this, but it's not counseling.
Just 1 second. I'm going to stop it just for a second. That's fine.
Okay. So that the issue of how we sort of became more closely integrated into the agency as it was a major focus, I guess, of the middle 80s. Here was this agency which in some cases was sort of developing a tail that was wagging the dog. Because what MSSP did, MSSP was different than anything we had ever done because it, number one, was a huge government grant. It was, number two, it not only provided a nurse and a social worker who would work with each of, in those days I think it was 500 clients, but it also allowed us to purchase up to a certain budget services for those clients in their homes, so long as we didn't spend more than what it would take to serve them in a nursing home. Remember, this was the waiver which allowed you to spend Medi-Cal dollars on non-medical services, because there was the idea, finally realized that if, let's say, you get some transportation for this lady so she can go pick up her medicine at the pharmacy, or you help bring in somebody to help her clean and cook, then that, as much as any nursing care difference, could keep her out of a nursing home. That sometimes it's non-medical care that keeps people out of nursing homes. And so there was a long list of the categories that we were allowed to purchase, categories of care such as personal care, home, cleaning, shopping, someone to cook, transportation, adult daycare, and also there was something called special services, where we could even come up with creative special needs. Like I remember we bought a special chair for someone that allowed sitting down and standing to be easier by pressing a handle. There was kind of a push on the sort of to help them get out of the chair. And I mean, we could build ramps to get people in their house on a wheelchair and stuff. There was a lot. There were a lot of leeways that we could use to purchase things for people. Now, these were people who were, number one, SSI level. They were Medi-Cal level. And number two, they were people who, at the point they came on our program, had to be eligible for nursing home care. So it was definitely an alternative to institutionalization. So it wasn't costing the government anything, and we were trying to prove the point. Those first 3 years we learned a lot. The first thing, from my point of view, it was the most exciting time, because what happened was the State Department of Aging, which had the responsibility for developing the program, didn't know exactly what it wanted to do. And so they awarded the grants to 8 agencies throughout the state. And they asked 2 people to be put on the payroll for a planning period. And those 2 people were sort of the representatives from that agency, and we spent a good deal of the summer of '79 in statewide meetings planning what the MSSP would look like. And so I was exposed to people, from other agencies. We were doing really very important work. I always laugh because I remember saying to somebody how I felt responsible for every older person in the state, until I met Barbara Sklar, who was my counterpart in San Francisco from Mount Zion, and she felt the same way. So we divided up the state, and I only had to worry about Fresno and South. And
how many sites were there?
8.
8 sites.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the 8 original sites, the 2 people, and Jennifer Chapman was my partner. She had actually just applied to the agency. She had just gotten her MBA and her MSW, and she'd applied to the agency for some fiscal, I think, it was in some kind of temporary fiscal role, and I met her, and she was very bright and very interested. And so we were on this grand adventure, and it was indeed a very heady time. Once we worked together and developed all these standards and developed the processes and the procedures and set sort of what the format would be, and they were constantly being evaluated. And then the program got started. There were lots of questions, and they were putting together actually 3 funding sources, and the funding sources themselves, which turned out to be Medi-Cal, some leftover money from, what was the second one, and Title III. I can't remember what this, State General Fund. So it was Medi-Cal, State General Fund, and Title III. And they wouldn't let us combine the money. So every time we spent any money, we had to identify what part of it came from Title III, what part of it, I mean, it was, and we were really novices. As much as Jennifer had those fancy titles, we weren't computerized, and we didn't, I don't think there were computers, and we were, at least we didn't have them, and we had to learn a lot. So we did, and we hired staff, and for me it was a big change because I had to give up the Freda Mohr Center. And so my job changed then in 1979, where I think I was given the title of administrator of MSSP, but that was my state title, so because of my participation in that grant. But then I was given the title of director of senior services, and I needed to hire someone to direct Freda Mohr Center, and I hired Sally Ellis. And many people, including you, kind of grew up with us in the organization. I mean, we started from various points. You were also K-Save.
I started at the K-Save.
Right. And then we're volunteer coordinator, activity director. But so I think, and what happened was then with Sally coming on, and the MSSP taking form, sort of other grants kind of fell into place because we began having a presence, not only locally, which or in the community nationally and locally, but also statewide. And the things that were different in the way we were operating, which caused us to be feeling like we were sort of cutting edge. I remember giving a report to the board that what had changed is, number one, we were contracting for services with subcontractors. So we were not only providing services, we were a funding source as well as, a provider of services. We were multidisciplinary for the first time. We had never hired nurses before. So we had nurses on staff. We didn't know what to do with them. I mean, I remember it was very hard getting the agency-wide, the person who was the agency-wide kind of personnel, bookkeeper, whatever, recognizing what we were doing because we were seen as so far out. The other thing is that because of the nature of MSSP, it doesn't separate program and fiscal the way the agency was used to doing. Traditionally, the agency had traditional social workers who didn't have a clue what it cost to have the agency hire them to provide that service. In other words, the district directors of the regional offices had no idea what their budgets were. They never knew what it cost for their offices to run, and they never had to think in those terms. There was a fiscal department, which was one person, and that fiscal, and it was as though they were the professionals, they were the program people. They could think about social work thoughts, and the fiscal responsibility was somebody else's. Certainly, the counselors never thought about it. I mean, if a counselor charged someone a fee for counseling, it hardly mattered. I mean, it was not an issue in the same way that, except in terms of what it meant to the person to pay that fee. I mean, it was a different time and place in terms of that. With MSSP, every social worker had to know what the budget was for their particular client, and they had to know how many services they could order. So they had to work very closely within a budget and be very conscious of that. Meanwhile, as administrators of it, we had to be very aware of what the program was costing and what we were charging, and how we contracted with a subcontractor for, let's say we hired Dynamic Home Care to do services for our clients. How much should we pay them? What was fair? I mean, we have to have a contract. I mean, we were in a totally different arena that we had never been in before. So I think, and then of course, just public-private, we suddenly had a government to answer to. So all of those were wonderfully broadening experiences, but they took their toll in a sense of trying to get the agency, the total agency, to understand how it was changing as a result of this sort of, addition to its.
Well, it's a dramatic change.
Dramatic.
And then what happened, it seems to me that the Freda Mohr Center, even though they were housed in the same building, the Freda Mohr Center was contained, and the MSSP on the other side of the building was contained. I know that
we should mention, by the way, that because where we left this chronologically is we were in the bank building. We moved in 1970. We moved there in 1979. After
you're right.
3 years of that, we realized what had happened was the bank building could not contain MSSP. So MSSP was down on Beverly, first in one place, then another. The Kosher Meals Program was off in another little building. The Home Secure was in another little building.
Right.
There was something else across the street I can't remember, but there were little.
But they were all self-contained.
Right. And so what we decided was it really was time to get a building that would house us all. And in 1982, that happened. And it really was a combination of funding, public, city, state. There was this Senior Bond Act that came out. So we had city funding, state funding. We had private donations. We had Jewish Community Foundation donation. We had, I can't remember, the Amundsen Foundation. I mean, there were any number of foundations that we had approached. And so it really was putting it all together that made this happen. A couple of other things happened during the years from 79 to 82 that impact our ability to offer this broad spectrum. Number one, after we got MSSP and we were in that little bank building, UCLA got the idea that it needed to do more geriatric health professionals, and they approached us and worked with us to develop a geriatric clinic as part of our operation. At first it was in the MSSP building. It was one little room, and then it came into the Senior Services building when we moved, and is there still. And that has made a big difference, now known as the Eichenbaum Health Center. Working with UCLA, again, expanded our horizons. We were able to link with health professionals in a way that was very beneficial to the clients, so we could be not only a social service agency, but also health services. And all of this has led us to be in a good place in terms of the way sort of the world changed with regard to aging, because it's almost as though we were forced into the cutting edge, onto the cutting edge, and then the world kind of caught up, because a holistic approach is exactly what's necessary now. The combination of fiscal and program is mandated by managed care. The interdisciplinary approach, the idea of contracting, all of those things now are sort of commonplace. And as we kind of struggled with them, we got into the stream of that, and there we were. So in 1982, we moved into the building that we're in now, and that sort of solidified us.
That's where I jumped again.
With the advent of MSSP and then the Eichenbaum Health Center, which in those days was the Soviet Oshan Health Center, other things came our way, and we began to be seen as a player, so that we had the kind of unique position of both being on the street providing services and also being somewhat involved in development of program and policy because of our participation in MSSP and, our being so involved with the city and the county. By then we were also contracting with the LA County for the city of West Hollywood. And we began contracting with the city of West Hollywood itself, and eventually also with the city of Beverly Hills and city of Culver City, Burbank, a few others for various programs. But as a result of that being in that position, we began to have new visibility, and so other opportunities came along. One was in an area where we had been very active, as you know, in board and care outreach. And so together, as I remember, we recognized a real gap in services and a need for additional services to people who needed more personal care but not more nursing care, who were living in board and care, wanted to stay there, their families wanted to stay there, the board and care owners wanted them to stay there, but they needed more care than the SSI allocation could provide, and so they would have to move to nursing homes where they really would not be in the most desirable environment. So we got some legislation written in conjunction with the California Department of Aging staff, who really supported it, and also authored by Bert Margolin, who was the local assemblyman at that time. And it allowed for a demonstration program with one unit in the south and one in the north to hire aides placed in nursing homes where placed in board and care homes where each aide would work with 7 or 8 clients and would be able to perform the kind of duties that would help that person stay in the nursing home. After many, many years, for many, many years, that program continued, at least in our site, and was able to do what was accomplished. It eventually became absorbed into MSSP for all kinds of complicated issues, but the hope had been that program, what we could see that program was accomplishing, would be recognized and that it would become kind of an entitlement. We had a very ambitious vision of it, which could have happened with a more favorable administration at the state level, but at that point things changed and there was never any money. So it wasn't ever, while it was sort of validated but not funded, it was always clearly approved of, but never really went beyond the 2 sites and then got absorbed into MSSP. There were a number of other programs, and we became very active, for example, in adult day health care, which we still are. That was also a challenge when we first started. I remember the first adult day health care center that we started at the Valley Storefront, which, by the way, Valley Storefront grew up in many of the same ways as the Freda Mohr Center. After I'd become Director of Senior Services, I remember a lot of the new programs that Dory Gradwell, who was Director of Valley Storefront, instigated, or that we learned about and seemed right for the Valley Storefront, among them Family Friends, which came for grants from National Council on Aging and Robert Wood Johnson, and other programs that came as a result of our being as active in developing this continuum of service. Adult day health care, as I mentioned before, being one of them. And adult day health care, when we first started it, I think it required 5 different distinct grants from different funding sources. And I remember the first time I introduced it to the board, someone said, "You mean to say you think you're going to get all 5 of those?" And it turns out we did. So we became active in the adult day health care kind of movement, because it is clearly a very important wave, I think, that will continue in the future. And then following that, we developed the Alzheimer's Daycare Center. And we have now that both at the Valley storefront, and we have adult day health care in town also in West Hollywood, and are just starting an adult, just got funded for an Alzheimer's Daycare Center there too. So the sort of beat moves on, but in each case, I think positioning ourselves has been as important as anything else in terms of being able, we see the need so clearly, and we've developed more credibility, I think, in trying to see where those things can get funded.
I've heard, all the successes and all the wonderful programs, but I know that each agency has many successes, but also has some things that they're not happy about. Like, what would be off the cuff kind of a failure that you felt like didn't work, and why?
Okay, I think, let me call it a challenge.
All right, not a failure, a challenge.
I think one of the issues that we are really struggling with now has to do with the fact that all this wonderful growth, and the growth is real and is extremely important in terms of what we're able to offer clients when we think of how we were in that tiny little storefront and what we had to kind of scrabble for and what we had to say no to and what is really available to older people now. That feels very good. But part of the reason we were able to develop all these programs is that we've had actually very, very, very talented and dedicated staff who sort of bought into each of these programs and was kind of the person. I mean, you remember where you were when we did CCFE. I mean, it took your being that kind involved in order to make that happen. And so we've developed all of these very, very strong individual programs, and by design, the professional leadership has created a very decentralized system, because we feel it, and we have always felt, and Paul Castro, the associate director, and I have both felt very strongly that the decentralized approach allows people to develop on their own, to buy into it, to own it, to make it theirs, and therefore they'll work very, very, very hard to make it work. What's happened now is that we almost find ourselves like in a position where we wonder, should there be more central control, where we hear somebody sort of not wanting to give the name of a volunteer because some other unit might steal them, or we're in very real circumstances. We've got to negotiate as to who will apply for to certain foundations for grants. We are so large now. We have 42 distinct programs, and so one of the issues that we constantly struggle with is how decentralized should we continue to be, and how much do we have to kind of rein in, and you lose something when you do that. On the other hand, we're able to provide supports agency-wide now in grant development and fundraising and PR and marketing, certainly in fiscal, that we couldn't before. So there's something that people gain by that. But that's really a challenge to us right now. There are others, too, because we're now, the question of our role within the Jewish community is a challenge. It feels as though there's, I would say, constant explaining necessary in order for people to understand who we are. People used to say we were the best kept secret. Now I think people think we're one thing because it's like which part of the elephant they're looking at. And if I say to somebody, I used to laugh and say, if you ask people from the city of LA who JFS was, they would say, oh, they're the aging agency in certain areas. If you ask the State Department, they'd say, oh, they do the resettlement. If you ask the county, they'd probably say, we have a meals program, but we work a lot with family violence. And if you ask the Jewish community, Federation, they would say we're the Jewish Social Service Agency. Well, the fact is we're all those things, but, you know, which leads me to one other problem, I mean, actually issue I would say that we've dealt with, and that has to do with our being sectarian or non-sectarian. We started out as a sectarian agency, and for years we were. Now, I don't think we ever refused service to anyone, certainly not in many of the units I was involved with, but there was an understanding that we were there to serve the Jewish population. That changed, and largely as a result of all these grants, and we now operate under Jewish values and traditions, and we have a Jewish heritage, but we are clearly a non-sectarian agency. What that allows us to do is to use a lot of externally funded programs to provide it for the Jewish population, but we also provide with those externally funded programs a lot of services to non-Jewish people. And while that's clearly the policy of the agency and the intent of the agency, it requires constant interpretation. First, to remind the Jewish community that we are serving the Jewish community, because that is lots of times questioned. And then to make it clear to the general community that we are non-sectarian. So sometimes I find myself feeling like we've got, in the same day, I'm reassuring people of the opposite situation, but both are true. Mm-hmm. And I feel very comfortable, and I believe this people running the programs who really know the way where our services are offered feel very comfortable with the fact that both are true, but the reality is people do see one part of the elephant. So that, I would say that, I don't know how well we've done that in every arena. We've been, I think, incredibly successful in being able to maintain programs that work. People have asked me, every time this comes up, if we're applying for a grant, and it's a one-year grant, and particularly like to the Jewish Community Foundation or something in the community, people will say, well, what are you going to do when it's over? You're increasing expectations. Remember that famous issue when MSSP was a demonstration program. What I've started to say is, we look at our history. I can't remember when a program was shut down, with one exception, because the funding ended and we couldn't continue. I mean, there were things like, well, okay, CCFE, but the clients were phased into MSSP and get the same services.
So it wasn't really.
So it wasn't. Mm-hmm. There have been times when we've had to cut down staff or change hours or something like that because funding, there were periods during the early 90s particularly where some of the funding sources were cut, United Way significantly and Federation, but programs continued. And so all the new things we started, with one exception, and this brings me over to the other part of the agency, which I need to sort of bring.
Okay, but before you do that, because you're still Director of Senior Services,
okay,
and we're going to move on to your growth as well as the agency's growth. All right, let's move on from you being Director of Senior Services to becoming, what was your next title?
I think it was Associate Executive Director.
Okay.
What happened was that because of the way the agency was structured, I was Director of Senior Services, but after we opened that big building and it was clearly recognized that aging was here to stay and that we were who we were, I was given the title of Associate Executive Director, and there were two of us who were Associate Executive Director. One person, Ethel Taft, was responsible for the non-aging part of the agency, and I was responsible for aging. And that continued for a period of, I think, 6 years. And it was, I guess, that was the time that was the most difficult in terms of integrating all of what we were doing into the agency as a whole, because it could no longer be the tail on the dog. It had to, the dog was different. It wasn't a puppy anymore. The dog was a very fat dog. And so that took a lot of changing. It took a lot of changing of systems. The fiscal system that the agency used did not work. It did not provide an audit trail that the government was satisfied with. For many years, we maintained two systems because the agency and the Federation mandated that we continue to be part of theirs, obviously, the agency, and the Federation wouldn't change, and we needed a different system, totally different system for the government audit. So we just had two fiscal systems, which was absurd. So that kind of struggle led to gradually the leadership of the agency recognizing that there had to be an integrated system. MSSP was no longer a demonstration program. We were here to stay. And in many ways, we were no longer an agency just of social workers. In the first place, we had a number of people who had grown up into levels of management who were social workers, who were either VA level people or people with all kinds of life experience. We had nurses, we had gerontologists, we have people with masters in public health, we have people in various specialties that come with, their own kind of degrees. So we had to recognize that we're different than we used to be, and so our staff development had to be, that had to be recognized. All kinds of things, even insurance and licensing and the way we represent ourselves and all. So that was a period, I guess I would say, that we struggled with and went through in the middle 80s. In 1988, there was a restructuring of the agency. The person who was the other associate executive director left to take a job as executive director of another agency of Jewish Vocational Services. And the board restructured what was the operational. The person who had been my fiscal director was appointed to be fiscal director of the whole agency, and then there was kind of there were then three of us who generally were responsible agency-wide. Arnold Saltzman, who was the executive director, I was associate executive director, and Paul Castro, who now is associate director, was then fiscal director. So with